Kneel Before Blog presents Kneel Before Pod.
Hello and welcome to the Kneel Before Pod interview segment. I'm your host Craig, and I had the recent privilege of talking to Victor Cook, the producer and supervising director of one of my personal favourite shows, The Spectacular Spider-Man. Listen as we talk about him, his career and what he has planned for the future. So I'm delighted to be joined on the podcast by Victor Cook, producer of one of my favourite cartoons of all time, Spectacular Spider-Man. How are you doing?
Doing great. Nice to be here.
Producer's the right title, isn't it?
I was a supervising producer and a supervising director on The Spectacular Spider-Man.
Yeah, so
and I
wore a
also,
few hats.
and I developed it along with Greg Wiseman. He handled his area was all the writing duties, and my area was all the visuals. And we came together in post.
Nice. So before we get on to that, I'm sure we'll have time for that later. Just a bit about yourself. So how did you get your start in the industry that you're in, and what inspired you to go into the kind of animation side of things?
Oh wow! I grew up an Air Force brat. My dad was in the U.S. Air Force, so I moved around a lot all over the States and also overseas in Okinawa and Japan. And I grew up a fan of comic books and cartoons, TV cartoons, because they hardly ever took us to the movies. So I was a 60s kid, and I grew up on Hanna-Barbera action cartoons and Marvel and DC comics. And I just loved to draw. And my heroes were Jack Kirby and Charles Schultz. So I think I always imagined myself becoming a comic strip artist or a comic book artist. And that's kind of what I did in my free time with my buddies. And when I got to junior high and high school, I did the campus newspaper, comic strips, and in college and so forth. And I was in a life drawing class in college my freshman year. And in those classes, there's a nude model, and everyone's drawing the figure and playing with light and shadow, and trying to be realistic. And I was always doing stuff like turning the face into a monster, or putting a cape on the character, or horns, or things like that. And a lot of art teachers don't like it when you do that, but I got lucky. This art teacher thought it was really cool, and she could see the direction that I wanted to head to. And she did say that one of her former students had gone off to work for Hanna-Barbera. Now, this is like back in the early 80s, by the way, just to give you some context. And she gave me his name and number and said, you should look him up. And the thing is, and this may surprise a lot of people listening, but at the time I had zero interest in a career in animation. I wanted to be a print cartoonist.
All right.
And like I mentioned a minute ago, Jack Kirby was one of my heroes, and I read in one of his biographies that one of his first jobs was as an in-betweener at the Fleischer Studios on those old Popeye and Betty Boop cartoons. And he said he hated it because he said it was like working at a car factory, and the job was like, somebody draws a hand over here to the left, and then you see that hand over to the right. His job was to do it in the middle, so you see that motion, right?
Yeah.
And ever since I read that, I thought, I have no interest in that. But then cut to maybe 5 years later, after I had been working in Orange County for magazines and newspapers and trying to sell comic strips, I finally thought, maybe I should see if I could look up this guy in animation, because I hadn't sold a comic strip yet. And by then, he was no longer at Hanna-Barbera, but he had turned me on to these classes at the Animation Guild. And I took a few of those. The teacher said Filmation was looking for animators. And I went down there and I took this test of He-Man and She-Ra jumping and pulling their swords out. And I got there at 9 a.m. and I finished at noon. And I was really nervous, and I was kind of beating myself up on the way home, like, why did I rush it? And but when I got home, I got a phone call, and they said I had done an 8-hour test in 3 hours, and when could I start? And that's how I first got my foot in the door in animation. And at that studio, they these days at TV animation studios, everybody's mixed up. A storyboard guy might be sitting right next door to a background painter or right next door to a writer. But back in those days, it was like, it was really separated by departments. So like the bottom floor of Filmation was all the ink and painters. The next floor was in-betweeners. The next floor was layout artists. And the top floor was the storyboard artists and the directors. And, I was given a tour when I first started. And as soon as I saw the storyboard department and saw storyboards, which were like 3 panels on a page, it reminded me of comic strips. And I thought, I want to be a storyboard artist. And so I started taking classes on the side to get me there. And anyway, that's really how I got my foot in the door, and that's how I got into storyboards. And the storyboard job got me in at Disney. And again, this is all just sounds like pure luck the way I'm saying it, but at Disney, my first show was Tailspin as a storyboard artist. And the producer had given this he had given this pep talk to the crew about, hey, everyone should learn everyone's job so you know everything there is to how to making these shows. Storyboard guys learn what the production people do. Production people, learn what the writers do, et cetera. And, I was so fresh and new and like a puppy dog that I just took it all to heart. I didn't realize, not everybody else did, but I did. And I immediately signed up for a UCLA extension class in animation writing. And I produced some samples in there. And and a few of them were based on Darkwing Duck, which was the show after Tailspin that I got onto. And I overheard some writers in the hallway saying, hey, we just sold a bunch more seasons to ABC and Disney Afternoon. We need stories. And I said, hey, can I show you what I did in class? And they liked it, and they told me to write it. And after I wrote that script, the executive producer of the show came knocking on my door and asked me, had I ever thought about directing someday, because he liked my storyboards and he liked that I wrote a script. He thought I understood storytelling, visual storytelling, and that was the beginning of Disney thinking of me as a director. So yeah, I did not set out to get into animation, but that's how I got into animation.
It does sound like Disney were very supportive of new talent as well. I remember reading anecdotes about Gargoyles in particular, which is another favourite of mine, where they encouraged the animation team to do essentially what you said there, and so that sounds great that they were able to give people the opportunity to just learn as much as they could while they were working on stuff. That sounds really cool.
Yeah, like right after I started, they started a storyboard trainee program, which was literally, I think, about 6 months after I was there, and so they were like recruiting people and training them into it. I came in as a revision artist and thought I would be doing that for a couple of years before getting a chance to do full-fledged storyboards. And somebody on one of the crews of Tailspin left, and they just had me fill his slot temporarily to see how I would do. And they liked my board, and that's how I became a storyboard guy at Disney. Mm-hmm. But yeah, they had this trainee program later, and it was a great place to work. It was a great place to learn.
Cool. And so you've done various roles on various shows. What are the kind of major differences between these different roles, and what changes when you do these different things on different shows? Or is it all kind of part of the same machine and you stick your oar in everywhere anyway?
It's different. When I was at Filmation, I was an in-betweener. I was ironically doing that job I described earlier that Jack Kirby did not like. Yeah. Where, I'm doing that middle drawing, right, to make the thing move. And so your focus is on that and making sure it's going to flow and it's on model and the line quality. You're really just sort of a piece of that scene only, right? That's your focus. When I got into storyboards, it was so much more of a different way of thinking, because you are like a director in a sense, because you're coming up with the shots. You're deciding when it's going to be a close-up. You're deciding how the character is going to act and be posed. But you're only doing that for the section you're storyboarding on, and you are doing it only in black and white. And all the music and sound is only what you hear in your head, other than the actor's recording. But it is sort of the training ground to direct. When I became a director, it was everything I've already just described to you, but then it'd be the whole episode. Yeah. And now you're involved in color, and now you're involved in, what will the character actually be designed to look like? What will the location be designed to look like? You are planning things while you're boarding for later now as a director, like where are you going to put a sound effect in and the kind of music you imagine? Are you going to play out a chase scene longer because you imagine music later? And you're just working with more people. As a storyboard artist, I was really only working directly with the director above me and maybe the storyboard artist next to me. Mm-hmm. And as a director, you're working with every storyboard artist, every designer. You're at the recordings. You're working with the writers. You're working on the whole thing. And then when you get a chance to produce, if you're going to be a creative producer, which I got that opportunity the last decade or so, it's everything a director does, but beyond. Now you're involved in hiring the music composers. You're involved in hiring the overseas animation studios. You are involved in the casting process. And if you're developing the show as well, you are now deciding the rules and the look of that show, as opposed to implementing something that's set forth for you. Like when I was at Disney, a lot of those shows were spin-offs from movies. Like, say, The Legend of Tarzan, for example. It was literally, based on the movie that came out. So from an art direction and tone and character, it was set by the movie, and our job was just to kind of carry it out. When I was on The Spectacular Spider-Man, even though the character had been around since the 1960s, it was like, but we had to decide, well, what will our version be, and what will it look like?
Cool. So sounds like you've got some great experience just doing different things. So jack of all trades, really cool. It's interesting to hear about how these things come together as well, because obviously when you watch the finished product, you don't appreciate how many things have to go in, how many elements have to come together to get that image on screen that moves and talks and all that stuff. Yeah. So it's really cool. A
lot of puzzle pieces, Yeah. And everybody has to sort of be working together in sync, and all the pieces have to come together to make that final thing that you watch on TV.
Yeah. So when you're not working, do you watch any kind of film, TV yourself, any other animation or live action stuff? And what are you kind of most looking forward to, or what do you follow?
I am pop culture, movie buff, art movies, popcorn movies. It was any kind of movie I love. I just love to watch movies. So I'll watch all the blockbusters, but I'll also watch the more serious stuff. So I probably go at least 3 weekends a month I'm at the movies. Because I love it, and I'm still learning. When you're watching the movies, I'm just sort of letting it wash over me and enjoying it as entertainment like anybody else. But by osmosis, you're sort of like absorbing what you're seeing. It's like film school for me too. Mm-hmm. As far as TV, because I'm I'm reading scripts and I'm making animatics and editing cartoons. It's like you're just always immersed in it. I tend to have kind of two types of TV when I come home. And one is like I just channel flip. I don't really stay on one thing, and it's like weird things like the Food Network or HGTV, where it's not really a scripted storyline. It's just sort of like let's watch these people shop for a home, or let's watch them upgrade this house, or those kind of things. But there are shows I will get hooked on and just kind of stay with, So like Westworld was one of them, and it just came back. The Walking Dead. I think I got into that by its third or fourth season, so I've been kind of still following that. Netflix. What's great about that is I can kind of binge them all in a couple of nights. So Lost in Space was another recent one that I got into.
I still haven't seen that, not at time, but it's on the list, high on the list. I want to see that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you say you see all the films, so are you kind of looking forward to anything, or what are your big highlights this year so far? There's been some notable stuff.
What am I looking for, you mean? I'm looking forward to? I'm looking forward to the next, I'm looking forward to the next Avengers movie,
Premiere is quite near you tonight, I believe.
Yeah, so I'm looking forward to that, because I've been definitely following the Marvel movie universe since Iron Man.
Yeah.
Which was really literally almost right after we started on the Spectacular Spider-Man too. the show came out in 2008, but we started working on it in 2007.
Yeah, it's just a juggernaut that won't stop, and I mean, I love it. I can't wait for the Avengers movie, so I'll be seeing that this week when it comes out. In terms of films this year, what are your kind of big highlights? As I said, there's been some notable stuff. A Quiet Place was my recent highlight. I thought it was a great showcase of visual storytelling, which is what you've been talking about so far.
They're so not alike. I would say, like, I like Dunkirk.
Mm-hmm.
I like the way the director played with sound in that, and in the feel and the vibe of it. But I also liked, oh my God, what's the one that just won Best Picture by Guillermo del Toro?
Shape of Water.
Yeah, Shape of Water. Yeah. I really like that one too. Really, was a great fantasy. And
yeah.
So, something that was kind of real and something that was kind of fantasy. I liked them both.
Cool. So you mentioned Netflix. You have something on Netflix at the moment, Stretch Armstrong and the Flex Fighters. So kind of how did that come about? It's quite an old character, so it's a modernisation of it. I'll confess I haven't actually seen the show yet, although I'm not sure it's available in the UK. I don't think it is. Maybe it is. You can correct me on that. But certainly,
I don't know.
But certainly it's on Netflix, and you've been tweeting out about it quite a lot. So kind of how did all that begin?
Well, Hasbro, they own the property, and you're right, it's based on that old sort of novelty toy that came out in the late 70s, the muscle man, like what was his job, by the way, that old Stretch Armstrong? He looked like a bodybuilder or some guy who hung out on the beach. But anyway, it was just like this novelty toy that kids like pulled and stretched until the corn syrup popped out. You didn't really play with that figure like you would like a G.I. Joe or a superhero action figure, because there was no personality or storyline to it. But Hasbro, they own Transformers, they own My Little Pony, and they own a lot of things, and they've been turning it into TV shows and movies, and Stretch Armstrong was something that they've been wanting to do too. But I think the problem was what we just said. There was really never a storyline or a personality to the character. He was just sort of this novelty toy, almost like a frisbee. It's just something he played with. It was an it, right? But they had been working on it for a while. It was in development as a movie for a while. Did some animation development. This is all before I came along. And I really got the job, I think, due to my work on the Spectacular Spider-Man. The head of development, Michael Vogel, was our exec at Sony when I was doing Spider-Man, and by the time I got contacted, he was at Hasbro and helped launch Hasbro Studios. And so he gave me a call, and I have to confess I wasn't really excited at first, because I thought, oh, it's going to be that visual of that old toy, and like it's maybe some kind of a silly thing. But what he said was, no, we're just going to keep the name, and of course he has to be able to stretch, but that's the only thing that has to be kept. It's a blank slate to create whatever you guys want to do. And I'm like, oh my God, it's a blank slate to create a brand new superhero universe, and that's exciting. It's exciting to, work on these Marvel or DC things, for sure, but to be able to kind of do something brand new, that just leaves the door like wide open. And so I got more and more excited about it. And they also brought in these two writers, Doc White and Kevin Burke, and we got to work developing the show. And we decided to make them teenagers, make sure they all three had completely different personalities and sort of slightly variations of the stretching power. And because this wasn't based on any already comic book that was created from the 60s, it's like there were things you can do with it if there was something you've always wanted to do. So in my case, I really wanted to see like a multi-ethnic lead cast. I was so sort of affected by Star Trek as a kid and seeing that vision of the future. And I'm like, well, the future's now. And if you go to New York City or Chicago or LA, it's very multi-ethnic. And so hopefully you'll get a chance to watch the show. It features these four leads, four teenagers: Jake Armstrong, He has blonde hair. I wanted to homage the old toy, so he is. That's about the only thing from the old toy that's the same as the blonde hair. And then he's got these two buddies, Ricardo and Nathan. And Ricardo is also Omnimass. He's played by O.G. Banks. And Nathan is Wingspan. He's played by Stephen Yun, who was Glenn on The Walking Dead. And I forgot to mention Stretch is Jake Armstrong, played by Scott Minville. And there's a fourth member of the team. I feel like, for anyone who hasn't watched the show, and you include, I have to give you a spoiler. There is a character called Blind Strike, who the whole first season you think is sort of this Boba Fett type assassin bad guy. And by the end of the season, it's revealed that it's not a bad guy, and it's also not even a guy. The armor does such a good job of concealing the face and the body that when the armor comes off, it ends up being this girl at school named Raya Dashti. So you get to it was just a great opportunity to create something from scratch.
Yeah, it sounds it. And you sort of attach it to a pre-existing property and you can do whatever you want. So you get kind of the best of both worlds there, I suppose.
Yeah, it's you get the name recognition, but there's a learning curve for the audience, especially because the name recognition is going to be for people who remember the old toy. Yeah. So if they're expecting the old toy, it's a surprise. That it's something new. And for a kid who doesn't remember the old toy, it's just a brand new show.
Yeah. And did you have any say in the casting? You mentioned, the names of the baby.
Oh yeah, we, myself, the Kevin and Doc, and the executives at Hasbro and Netflix, we all put our heads together, and we were just really trying to think who could really embody all these different characters, cast of characters in the show, and we were all like pretty much in agreement on who should be who, and who are the right people to play these characters. In addition to Scott and OG and Steven and I forgot to say Nazneen Contractor plays Raya Dashti / AKA Blind Strike. So in addition to them, we have a character called Dr. C, played by Kate Mulgrew. We have this guy, Jonathan Rook, played by Will Wheaton. Mm-hmm. We have this science teacher, Mr. Savick, played by Walter Koenig. I mean, I think you're sensing that we have a Star Trek connection there with those three guys. Keith David, who was the voice of Goliath and Gargoyles, which you mentioned.
That's a good voice to get.
Yeah, he's one of our main characters named Kane in the show. So we got some great actors, and they really have brought these characters to life. And so myself and the producers and all of us had a say in casting these characters.
Great. And another old property, iconic property you've been involved in is Scooby Doo. So were you a fan of that kind of growing up? And what did you see as your approach for it? Did you want to homage the original or take it in a new direction, or a bit of both, really?
Well, I have to be honest. I remember the Scooby Doo show as a kid, and I kind of enjoyed Scooby Doo and Jabberjaws and kind of all those types of shows. But I was a superhero guy, so the Hanna-Barbera cartoons that I really liked as a kid were like the Herculoids, Space Ghost, the Impossibles, Up and Adamant, Johnny Quest. I mean, those are the ones I really tuned in for, and Scooby, Jabberjaw's other one, I just sort of enjoyed when they were on, but I wasn't really chasing after those, Yeah. But, you stay in this business long enough. There's kind of a saying, you stay in the TV animation business long enough, eventually you're going to work on Scooby-Doo at some point in your career. And I was lucky with the one I got to work on. I really cannot take any credit for the development of the show. Scooby-Doo Mystery Incorporated. It was Tony Cervoni and Mitch Watts. They had developed this and kind of came up with the concept for this one. And they hired me on to be a director and a supervising director to help make the show. But I loved it because it was Scooby-Doo, but with depth. It was Scooby-Doo with an ongoing story. It was like Lost for kids. And the archetypes of the main characters, you kind of got you went deeper into Fred. You went deeper into Shaggy. I know it sounds silly. You went deeper into all the characters. And in Scooby Doo Mystery Incorporated, what I loved is, like, as the episodes progressed, it became apparent that no, this is not just, the monsters aren't just people in a mask. These monsters are monsters.
Yeah.
And there's a real evil, supernatural evil that's the cause of all this. And it got really big. It was a real epic in scope. And if you've watched the show, what happens is this show is considered the prequel of the original show.
All right.
Because in the very last episode of the show, everything gets solved and fixed, and now they got to travel cross country to meet this professor, and that's how the show ends. And if you remember the original show, it's the van just traveling from town to town, solving mysteries. So it was great. It was fantastic. Everything about it. I just was awesome. The writing, the story arc, the tone of it. I remember when we were talking about monster chases and when monsters would show up. Having talks with Tony, that we really weren't going to do it where people like ran in the air for 5 seconds, then took off, or hair would go into static. We weren't going to do those tropes. We were going to try to do it more like, what if it was real, Yeah. And so we staged it that way. I mean, there was still comedy and humor in it, of course, but we really went for making it cinematic. Besides myself, there was another director named Kurt Gaeta, who is known for a lot of DC superhero cartoons, and so he brought that sort of mindset to how he was going to stage it. And then the art direction, the character designs are, they're at the same time recognizably these classic characters, but they're edged up just enough to make them modern. That was done by Derek Wyatt. And I feel like also his designs helped the overseas studios really be able to animate them better and keep them more on model better, because they weren't all super rounded. Yeah. And then there was the art direction. The backgrounds is like the most beautiful background paintings I had seen in a TV series. Art directed by Dan Kroll, first season, the second season by Steve Nicodemus. And besides the textures and the look of the backgrounds, it was also painted for moods. You'd have like green sequences or red sequences depending on what was going on. It was fantastic. Everything about it was awesome.
Cool. It's funny you say about working in the industry long enough, you eventually show up in Scooby Doo. The Supernatural proved that recently when they did their crossover episode, which I absolutely loved, and I think it's a fan favorite already. It was only on a couple of weeks
since you
ago.
bring up that, because that's kind of the classic Scooby design teamed up with Supernatural. So right after Mystery Incorporated, we did 52 episodes of that. I did get the opportunity to work on the more classic designed Scooby Doo, because that's how they do the DVDs. The DVDs are sort of always based on the classic design look. Yeah. And the TV shows are where they sort of experiment with kind of a different art direction each time. So I got to do Stage Fright and a few 30-minute specials based on the classic designs. Nice.
Yeah. So you also directed 2 Hellboy movies, the animated ones, which is, I absolutely loved them when I saw them. There was kind of a little bit of crossover with the films in terms of the voice cast, and Del Toro was a producer on them. So what was it kind of like directing Hellboy? Did you read the comics? Did you take influence from the movies? Did you bring both in? And did you do any work with Del Toro himself?
Yeah, I love the movies. I just want to point out there were 2 Hellboy animated DVD movies made. I actually only directed one of them. I directed the second one.
My apologies. Yeah,
I directed the second one. That's okay. I didn't work with Guillermo directly. I worked with Tad Stones, who was the producer, and Mike Mignola was closely involved with both of these DVDs as far as the story. And the design look of Hellboy is a little bit different from the comic books. Going into it, I thought we were going to animate Mike Mignola's art style, which I think would have been awesome. But, sometimes there are like corporate decisions made above your head and before you get involved. And so, like I said, I came on in the second DVD. So by then, a lot of things were set. So I think there was some corporate decision that this would need to have a slightly different look so they could actually make another set of toys. They had the toys based on the live action movies, toys and figures based on Mike Mignola's comic book, and so they saw this as I think the reason why they did this is they saw this as opportunity for another set of toys. So that's why the animated designs are a bit different. And that was by Sean Galloway, and that's how I met him. And we'll talk more about him later, but that's how I discovered I wanted him to do Spider-Man later. But those are really fun. The Hellboy I worked on, we actually, after we did the animatic, it was short. We were too short. We had to figure out a way to have it fill the time, and so that's where we kind of have that backwards Memento storyline happening simultaneously in the story. That kind of came out of that to sort of fill it in more, Yeah. But you're right. We had the original voice cast come in. Abe Sapien. It wasn't the voice of Abe Sapien. It was actually Doug Jones who did the body acting for Abe. Did the voice. It's kind of strange, but that's
he does he plays the full character in the second Hellboy film as well. Yeah, in the first one it was David Hyde Pierce, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it was pretty impressive. They got them all to come back to do the voices, and it was really fun to work on.
Yeah, I've always liked Hellboy. It's that kind of quirky, slightly dark but humorous sort of thing. And I'm kind of disappointed that we'll never get a Hellboy 3 from Del Toro. But those animated movies were an interesting, different take because I hadn't really read the comics by that point, but I know they were a little bit more comic influenced in terms of the world and stuff. So. So that was cool to see a different
comic influence, and there was plans for a third, but unfortunately, we only got to make the only two got to be made.
Yeah, as often happens, I suppose. So on to the main event, I guess. Spectacular Spider-Man, which is hands down one of my favorite cartoons that I've ever watched. I loved it from the first episode. I'm a huge fan of the character, so I really appreciated the way it was built and the way that Peter Parker's world was built with a modern spin on it, but still a kind of classic Stan Lee, Steve Ditko-esque feel to it. I really appreciated that. So, how were you brought into that onto that project, and were you a fan of that character to begin with? You mentioned Jack Kirby, who did a bit of work in Marvel, back in the day.
Yeah, huge Spider-Man fan. I'm old enough to where I was 5-year-old kid when that original cartoon came out. So I'm always singing that song back then when I was a kid and loved the comics. And when I got older, I'd go back and reread the original Ditko Lee, when it first came out. I was called in to interview for the job probably over almost a year before it started while I was on Hellboy. Being on Hellboy actually got me the interview. I was at Disney for all those years before it, and even though I worked on shows like The Legend of Tarzan or Buzz Lightyear Star Command, and to me, I saw those were like action shows. I kind of quickly found out that two people who have produced and directed on sort of DC or Marvel superhero shows, they really didn't think that a show with a talking elephant or a robot that falls to pieces with all these comedy elements, they didn't really think of those as like straight action shows. So I didn't really have anything like that in my experience until I did Hellboy, and just being on Hellboy alone got me the meeting. Mm-hmm. And then almost a year later, the show got started and they hired me, and that's how I got on. I met with Michael Vogel, who I had mentioned to you earlier.
Yeah.
And he would just ask me, visually, how would I approach it? What would I do? And you got to remember, this is back in 2007. So they had done a couple of Tobey Maguire movies at this time, right?
Yeah.
And there was a couple things. I wanted to see squash and stretch animation in an action show. All the superhero shows I had seen up till then seemed to be kind of a combination of sort of wanting the comic book illustrations to move or realistic. And And being animated overseas, it's like it's a tall order to make that look good, with all that detail and muscles and stuff. So I wanted it to be stylized, and I wanted to have the squash and stretch. And what I mean by squash and stretch is if you watch, say, Mulan, for instance, and Mulan has some kind of realer characters like Captain Shang and Mulan and the bad guy, right?
Yeah.
But even the way they move, there's kind of a squash and stretch to their gestures and movements. I really wanted to see that in a show, and I wanted to bring that to it. I wanted to see those original Ditko graphics in animation. Believe it or not, the half Spidey mask over the face that you'd see in those old Ditko comics had never been done in any cartoon yet.
And the spider symbol that closed the episode as well, that was a common thing in the comics.
Yeah, at the end of those comics, you'd see Peter Parker, Spider-Man walk off all lonely, and above the skyline, you'd see the red sky with the webs.
Yeah.
Never done before, and I wanted to have all that in there. And then the action sequences, the animated Spider-Mans I'd seen before that, as much as I loved them, it's like he pretty much just swung on the web line like Tarzan would swing on a vine, and he'd web up bad guys kind of in a net, or he'd punch people. And I'm like, I really want to bring a Hong Kong flair to this. I really want to have this sort of choreography with the webs and the environments to where he's like taking these guys out, almost not even having to punch them, And by the way, I feel like I've seen a lot of that now reflected in the current movies, but that's what I wanted to do back then. Mm-hmm. And I wanted special color sequences. I didn't want things to be just in the daytime or just in the nighttime. I wanted to sort of have some symbolic color sequences, and Vogel really liked hearing that, and that's pretty much how I got the gig. Greg and I, together as we're developing the show, it's like we really wanted to explore when Peter first became Spider-Man. We really wanted to update those lead Ditko when Spider-Man first appeared on the scene, but put it in the modern context of 2008, which was contemporary 10 years ago. Yeah. And in doing that, like I mentioned in Stretch Armstrong, we could make it multi-ethnic. One of the things we did back on the Spectacular Spider-Man is this takes place in New York City, and the creators created it back in the 60s, and I think the only non-white character was Robbie Robertson, the assistant editor. But we said, but if this is going to look like Manhattan in New York City, we need to sort of be more inclusive, and that's why Liz Allen's Hispanic, that's why Ned Leeds is Asian, et cetera, et cetera. Kenny Kingston became Kenny Kong, and so anyway, I'm rambling again. Sorry about that.
No, go ahead. It's fascinating stuff.
Yeah, so it was just an opportunity to really do what we wanted to do on that.
Yeah, and the diverse cast, I think, was remarked on favourably at the time as well, because the kind of casual approach to diversity is always appreciated because it doesn't make a big deal out of it.
They don't make a big deal of it, and I think when the comics came out, I think it was just reflective of their times and their days. I don't think there's anything sort of evil about it. I think it just didn't occur to the creators at that time to change up the characters. But we live in a modern time, and you can just look out the window if you're in any of these big cities, and you could see we have all of humanity out there, and we wanted to reflect that. But we also wanted to have fun with the characters too. So another thing is we just really wanted to get into, like, if you're a 15-year-old kid and you get the powers of Spider-Man, you are having the time of your life and a blast. We wanted to see that in there. I would say one of the things I missed, but I love the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man movies, the Sam Raimi movies, but I feel like the part that was kind of missing was the Spider-Man smart alecky part when he was Spider-Man, and we really wanted to have that smart aleck jokester having the time of his life put in there, but also the Peter Parker stuff of in his real life, all these problems he's got to deal with, and how is he going to handle that while also taking on the bad guy at the same time?
Fighting Electro, but having to be home by 10 and all that kind of stuff.
Exactly.
That was the classic kind of storytelling, and the stakes were associated with, he's going to win, but he's also got to get grounded. So there's that problem.
The theme of the show, and this is Greg really came up with this as he was mapping out the storylines, but because we start the show where Peter got bitten by the spider at the beginning of the summer before his sophomore year. So he's had 3 months. Like, our show starts at the beginning of sophomore year. So the idea is he's spent the last 3 months as Spider-Man, practicing his powers and pretty much easily putting common crooks away in jail and things like that. He never had to deal with a supervillain before in his life until the Vulture and the Enforcers, right?
Yeah.
In episode 1. But also, his hormones are going crazy. So, and he's got these issues of trying to earn enough money and make sure Aunt May is okay. So he had to navigate high school, navigate social cliques, but he's also had to learn to take on super bad guys. So the theme of the show was the education of Peter Parker, the education of Spider-Man.
Yeah, and I always loved the animation style. I remember seeing early pictures of it and thinking, I wasn't too sure about it to begin with, but as soon as I saw it in motion, I understood the decision because it made the fights and just any of the action just so kinetic and fast-paced and everything like that. And it was just distinctive. You look at these characters and you know exactly who they are. And
no two faces look alike. That's the strength of Sean Galloway. I saw when I was in Hellboy, they had he had done the concepts of designs. And by the way, Mike Mignola handpicked Sean Galloway to do the redesigns on animated Hellboy. So that was a Mike Mignola tree. He chose the guy out of a lot of people. And but the producer decided for production reasons and make things flow and Sean's experience at the time, I guess, the producer decided to have a more experienced designer kind of go over Sean's concepts. Mm-hmm. And do the turnarounds. But when I was there, I saw Sean's original concepts, and I kind of fell in love with those. And I thought, I want that in the Spectacular Spider-Man because it felt animatable. Like you said, it was very unique. And when Sean did his first passes on some of the classic Spider-Man characters like J. Jonah Jameson and Doc Ock and Sandman, the Vulture, it's like they did a few things at the same time. One was, they felt like the classic characters, but it also felt fresh, new, and modern the way it was filtered through the way he stylized them. And then from an animation point of view, it's like, wow, the economy of lines that it took to create those characters were few. You didn't draw every six-pack muscle or every bicep or everything, so it was like far less for the animators to have to in between all the time, so they could focus on doing really good animation in the time they had. Mm-hmm. The big challenge was Spider-Man's suit, right? The original 1960s Spider-Man show, the way they sort of simplified it was, if you've seen the show, there's only webbing on his mask, and the other red parts of him is just solid red, so it doesn't really evoke the suit perfectly. And then the other Spider-Man shows in between, they draw every web, so it is more true to the comic books, but I feel like it doesn't move as well. Mm-hmm. The animation is a bit clunkier because the animators only have so many weeks they can do it. So we distilled those webs to be as few as we could, but still have a web pattern. So there's really sort of like a center line, and then it just kind of spokes out twice at the bottom and twice at the top. And that was enough. And that's how we got this great fluid squash and stretch animation to our action scenes.
And you brought back his web wings as well to give a bit of extra nostalgia.
Oh, yeah, we brought back his web wings. That's just all the classic Ditko things we wanted to bring back.
Yeah, it's cool. And one thing I always appreciated was the kind of the setup of the action sequences as well. It wasn't just him fighting. He was using his intelligence. And the one I remember most fondly, it's one of the kind of cleverest examples for me is when he's fighting the Rhino, and he stops him by essentially making him sweat until he passes out. And it's not something I can recall ever having seen in the comics even. It was just a completely unique way to defeat such a kind of derivative villain in a lot of ways. And that's kind of what I liked. So it was, did you have a lot of say in kind of how they came about and what you were going to try out in action sequences?
I have to give credit to that one in particular. That goes to the writers. That was like written into the script. But the action scenes in general, I think Greg and the writers would agree, was a real combination teamwork between what was written and the storyboard artists and the directors, because there was a lot you saw that was not in the script, but inspired by the script. So, for instance, if you remember, I'll give you an example. Episode 1, Spider-Man is on the rooftop fighting the Enforcers, and Ox gets him in a bear hug. And in the script, Spider-Man either elbows him or kicks him in the shins somehow to break loose. And we thought it would be funnier and more smart alecky of Peter and Spider-Man if he were to web Ox's handlebar mustache and yank on him. Things like that. Yeah. Or the rooftop fight in the prologue of episode 13 with all the thugs in the helicopter. That was all invented by the storyboard artists. Okay. What was scripted was thugs were going to the rooftop to escape, and Spider-Man beats them up. That's written, but the actual choreography of what you saw, and the helicopter even taken off, and all those things, and mace ball bullets and all this kind of stuff, it was all dreamed up by the storyboard artist. But like I said, the situation is also inspired by what's written.
Was that one a possible reference to the original trailer for the first Spider-Man film with the helicopter in the middle of the Twin Towers?
I don't think so. That was actually the expansion of the promo we did. Yeah. We did a 1-minute promo that we showed at 2007 Comic-Con, about 9 months before the show came out. And so you saw a tiny bit of the rooftop thing in the promo, but the storyboard was probably like 5 minutes long. It was like I said, all this stuff got invented on the board because we were really experimenting and messing around with how many ways could Spider-Man take out these thugs without actually punching him. Remember, that's how I pitched to Vogel how I wanted to do the show. So we just did all these different things where he's webbing two guys and yanking them together, their heads hit, or he looks like he's going to web you, but he shoots the web past you, so you think he missed. But what he really did was he's webbing a piece of an air conditioning vent and yanks it off the wall, hits him in the back of the head, or all these different ideas. Yeah. It was just way too much for the promo, so it just all got on the cutting room floor. But I always loved it. The helicopter took off, all that kind of stuff, and I loved it. So as we were doing the show, I had mentioned to Greg and to Kevin Hops, one of the writers, we got to figure out a way to stuff. It's like the best thug. It's the best fight scene we have with Spider-Man against just thugs. We got to get it into the show, and they came up with a way of that would fit the storyline by having it in the prologue of episode 13.
Cool. And
that's where it came from. It really wasn't from the movie. Yeah. Now, if you're asking, were we inspired by the movie or the comics with certain scenes that got put into the show, the answer is yes. And the same even for the show. Because even though we wanted to do our modern, updated version of the Lee Ditko years, we had every era to choose from. We had every era of the comic books. We had every movie that had been made up to that time. So we could pick and choose what we want and conflate it into this high school era. Because, Eddie Brock obviously didn't exist in the Lee Ditko era of the comics. Yeah. He wasn't of that time. And Gwen Stacy also came later after the high school years. Mm-hmm. But we picked and chose what we liked, and we kind of merged them together to do the show that we wanted to do.
And then you could create a mystery around Osborn as well, because everybody knows who he is. But then
everybody knows who he is, and we definitely had fun with that. You mentioned Osborn and the Goblin, and voice actors. At least I'm piecing it all out into my head. It's just making me think of something. When we were spotting the sound effects for that promo I mentioned to you that we showed that summer of 2007, we had already started recording the episodes by then, because we had already started storyboarding the show by then, and we had cast Steve Bloom as the Green Goblin. Mm-hmm. And he had this distinctive laugh and this distinctive way of talking that when it came time to spot the explosion of the pumpkin bomb in that promo, it just kind of occurred to me to ask the sound editor, God, do you have anything that sounds like a scream that would sound like Stephen Bloom's voice? and that's why whenever the pumpkin bombs explode, you have that scream that goes with it. We kind of fell in love with that,
It's very memorable. I did love that. In terms of the casting,
same thing with we all had a say in it. We had our first choices, Greg and I, but everybody had a say in it. Sony and Marvel, and you sort of prepare yourself that. Well, what if we don't agree? Are we going to have a big fight over this? If we're going to have some kind of debate? And we were like pleasantly surprised that just about every first choice that Greg and I had, Marvel and Sony agreed, and that's how we got Josh Keaton. That's how we got all these actors, and they're fantastic. The one thing, like we were talking about the Green Goblin, his alter ego, Norman Osborn, was played by Alan Rations from LA Law at the time. That guy, the voice quality and the acting as Norman is amazing. I mean, that guy's never going to win any. He'll never win any Father of the Year awards. But he was as far as the Norman Osborn character, he was great, but amazing, one of the top actors. But the one thing I do remember at the records is he could never really convincingly fall, if you know what I mean. So when the Vulture was flying him up in the sky and dropping him and trying to scare him and stuff, he's falling. So you're like, ah! And it never came out right when Alan did it, But it was fun times, really fun times working with that cast.
And you had some big guest stars such as Tricia Helfer as Black Cat. She was quite an inspired choice. And some of the actors have enjoyed further work later on. Josh Keaton's played him in a bunch of video games, and Tricia Helfer's been Black Cat a few times, I think, as well. Yeah.
Well, Josh, to me, and I think a lot of fans agree, is like the definitive spectacular Spider-Man Peter Parker. He is that character. He embodies that character of that age. He was just perfectly cast. And, I don't know that we would have fallen in love with Peter and Spider-Man and related to his personal problems as much, if not for Josh's performance. He's amazing.
Yeah. I grew up on the 90s cartoons, so whenever I read a comic, I hear Chris Daniel Barnes' voice. But that's just because that's who I grew up with. But Josh Keaton's performance was excellent. It's always great to hear him return to the character. If the show had continued in a third season, can you kind of talk a bit about what the plans were for that? I mean, it was kind of unceremoniously cancelled due to a rights issue, which is a shame. It was when Sony lost the TV rights to Spider-Man or something like that? Disney just cancelled the show or whatever it was.
Well, I mean, I don't want to give any specifics of what we're going to do, but we did have plans to hopefully do 65 episodes and follow Peter all the way to high school graduation. So you saw in the show, unlike I can't think of any other animated shows that have done this. Most animated shows, it's this nebulous same time of year all the time, except for that very special Christmas episode, right? Otherwise, it's the same time of year. We literally showed a progression of time from the first day of school. And you saw the first season go to New Year's Eve, I think, or New Year's. Yeah. And then second season, we start right after that. It's wintertime, and we take it almost to spring. So that's about the speed that we were moving. And so we felt like if we kind of moved that, and we got to do 65 episodes, we would have went to high school graduation. I will say this, at least. We did have a spring break storyline that we wanted to do that involved the lizard and with everybody in Florida. And that's about the most I'll say to that. But we did have plans. I've noticed Greg does not sort of divulge those, and so I'm going to follow suit and also not talk about that, other than to say what I just said.
Fair enough. Yeah. Just in case we ever get an opportunity to revisit it, it'd be nice to be surprised and stuff. Yeah. Was there ever any plans to bring in other Marvel characters? Because he very much existed in a world on his own. He was the only superhero, and the villain world was his world. But obviously, with the Marvel Cinematic Universe,
early on in development, to be honest, we did have ideas to have some guest stars and crossovers from other Marvel properties. But at the time, and as you even know from the movies, sometimes there are rights issues, right?
Yeah.
So, and that includes villains. And so, but I'm saying this is very, very early on in the development. So once we realized we couldn't do that, we said, we're going to just focus on Peter and Spider-Man and his cast. Yeah. And I feel like you really because we didn't delve into other superheroes, you really got to know these other characters. You got to know Mary Jane. You got to know Liz. You got to know Flash. You got to see Flash evolve, right? He wasn't just the one-note jock bully. So I think it was like a blessing in disguise. Because we couldn't use other characters from other comics, we focus on the characters of Peter's world and universe.
Unfortunately, it's more than big enough.
We had a different big bad guy planned instead of Tombstone, by the way.
All right.
We couldn't use him. And that's why we used Tombstone. And I'm glad, because I think Tombstone turned out to be like an awesome bad guy for us.
Was it Kingpin by any chance? Was that the plan?
I'm not going to say.
Yeah. Yeah, that was great, bringing in the big man and changing out the identity and all that kind of stuff. It's a nice surprise to people that know the material, which I always like to be surprised. The same with the Harry twist at the end of season 1, and then the Norman twist at the end of season 2. It kept me on my toes because I was, because I had certain expectations as a fan, and then it kind of subverted them, which I always like. I don't like it when I can predict everything out of the gate, but certainly plenty there. So it was a great job.
We really wanted to, this was an era before Netflix and before, binge watching shows. It was an era where it wasn't always so easy to do an animated show for American TV with a continuing storyline. It is now, but just before that, it was difficult because they'd want to be able to air episodes out of order if they wanted to. And if you had a continuing storyline, it was not easy. But fortunately, we were able to do it. And so the show got to really be one story. It was really one story, one long story. And being able to do that meant we didn't have to do the typical thing where you're going to meet the bad guy before he becomes the bad guy in one episode. Like you meet so-and-so, something happens to him, he becomes so-and-so.
Yeah.
And then our superhero puts so-and-so in jail all in one episode. In our show, and you know this, but watching the show, is you met supervillains before they were supervillains. You got to know these characters for a few episodes, and in some cases almost the whole first season before they turned into the supervillains. So it kind of gave more impact and more weight when that happened. That's what we tried to do with the Venom and Eddie Brock thing, is really establish this long-time relationship between Peter and Eddie before he became Venom. So it'd be a little heartbreaking at the same time that it happened,
Yeah. That was definitely one of the draws of it, the kind of pseudo-serialization, still episodic, but had serialized elements. So, kind of credits your audience with that intelligence to follow it and get invested in the world as well. So, absolutely love that.
Honestly, when you say that, like the audience, we never thought we were making a cartoon for, say, older people.
Yeah.
We thought of it as we're making an all ages cartoon. And it basically in the spirit of the comics of the 60s. Like these days, what kind of makes me a little sad these days is you go into a comic book shop and comic books of some of your favorite characters tend to be written for teenagers or young adults, or not kids is what I mean. It's inappropriate for kids, some of it. Yeah. Because it kind of gets into R-rated territory, because that's how they're defining it to be mature, right? And then there'll be a kid section. And the kid section comics, they're not they're written in a way that aren't going to be that interesting for you and me. But the magic and the beauty of those Marvel comics of the 60s is they were written for everybody. So if you were a 5-year-old kid and you read a Hulk or a Spider-Man comic, maybe you didn't get everything, but you loved it, and it wasn't and what was in there was not inappropriate for you. So it wasn't like you're doing something wrong having this comic book.
Yeah.
But the stories and the interplay between the characters was also at a level that if you were a college kid, a teenager, a young adult, you were really into it like any other fiction you had read. So it was like for everybody. And that's how we approached the show. We really didn't want to make it, no, it's only for 6-year-olds. Yeah. We wanted 6-year-olds to be able to watch the show and love the show, but we didn't want to write towards only written for a 6-year-old. And I think that's why it still stands up today.
It's definitely the right approach. Absolutely. Yeah, because I like watching cartoons and I like the smart ones, so it's why I didn't like Ultimate Spider-Man as much, because I felt like it was skewing younger than me. But Spectacular was just my perfect Spider-Man experience, and I was kind of looking for that for years myself. So yeah, right. Definitely the right approach. How did you get the song? I've always wanted to know that.
Well, I mentioned I was such a huge fan of the 60s Spider-Man, and yeah. One of the biggest fun parts of that show was actually that theme song. So we all loved that song. We all wanted a theme song of our own that was like that, and that people would hum and be iconic, and we could do a great main title sequence too. And so we auditioned a few different bands and composers. And again, it was one of these situations where, again, myself, Greg, and Marvel, and Sony, we all were in unanimous agreement on Tinderbox for that theme song. And, I still love the original Spider-Man theme song, but I feel like ours is just as iconic. Anyway, that's how we found them. And that's why we decided to do it, too. We didn't want just music. Yeah. We really wanted the theme song.
And then all the kind of incidental music seems like it was inspired by that song as well. The kind of that rock soundtrack throughout the swinging scenes and fight scenes.
Yeah, the score of the show, which not the theme song part, but the score of the show was done by Dynamic Music Partners. Okay. Who they're famous for working on Batman the Animated Series and a lot of different superhero shows. But yeah, they were fantastic because they. You watch the show, and it's like every villain had their own thing. Yeah. Every villain had their own thing. And Spider-Man, of course, had his own, not main title theme, but his in-the-show theme. And it was great. So they played with different instrumentations, different melodies. It was really great.
And the song was so iconic that even Ox was humming it in one episode.
Exactly.
That was a nice little touch.
We were all humming it. We were all humming it at work. It was great.
A breaking of the fourth wall within almost, it was a nice touch, that. So just kind of a last point. What are your kind of dream projects or ideas that you have for the future? What's kind of next for you?
Dream projects. There's There's a comic book I did with Greg a few years back called Mechanation. I mean, that is something I'd love to see be turned into an animated TV series. And then I have a few others which I cannot say on the podcast because they're still they're not out there in the public yet.
Okay.
To pitch. But as far as the next project that I'm working on, I'm doing a Disney Junior show.
Oh, right.
Tots. Mm-hmm. It's a CG show, and it's a comedy, and it will premiere sometime in spring or summer of 2019. And so I'm looking forward to everybody seeing that. There's still another season of Stretch Armstrong and the Flex Spiders that's coming on later this year. So I'm looking forward to everybody seeing that.
Oh, nice. Cool. So a few things in the pipeline then. That's always good.
Okay.
Yeah. So final question. We ask this of everyone who comes on the interview segment. Since we're a comic book inspired website and, nerdy podcast, we always ask, what superpower do you have and why?
Wow. I think I'd like to have the superpower of flying. or
That's a
levitating
popular
and
one.
flying.
Yeah.
That would be just so cool, And I don't mean like with a jetpack or something, but more like the Superman way of flying or the Peter Pan way of flying, where you could just fly, and by willpower you make yourself go wherever you're going to go, and you land. It's like that would be so awesome.
Yes, a popular one. A lot of people like it. Yeah, cool.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
It'd be a great way to commute. Be a great way to commute to work, right?
Yeah, definitely. Might have to wrap up warm if depending on how you're going, but yeah. Watch out for thin air and all that stuff.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. Really enjoyed talking to you, hearing the kind of backstage secrets about all these kind of cartoons and things you work on. It's been very illuminating. I've absolutely loved this conversation, so thank you very much.
Oh, it's great to be here. I love talking about these shows. They're so fun to work on, and it makes us all very happy that you and everybody out there, the fans, still love these shows. Makes it feel all the hard work was well worth it.
Definitely. Well, thank you very much, and all the best for your future projects.
Thank you.
That was my discussion with Victor Cook. A big thank you to him for taking the time to appear on this podcast and talk to me. Thanks to YouTuber nstens1117 for the supplied music. If you like what you heard, then hit that subscribe button on iTunes, YouTube, or any major podcasting app. And join us on the next Kneel Before Pod.